Boston's monument to the 54th Regiment and its commander, Robert Gould Shaw, is widely hailed as a work of art and statement of purpose. After more than 120 years overlooking Boston Common, the monument's due for some restoration work, thanks to a partnership between public agencies, Friends of the Boston Public Garden. The project will also include a new round of conversations organized by the Museum of African American History. And joining us in the museum is its Director of Education and Interpretation, Lemerche Frazier. Thank you very much for being with us, Lemerche.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Lemerche, we were so used to seeing this as the first black regiment for the Union in the Civil War, and people said, well, how did they get started? I mean, whose initiative was this?
Actually, it was the first black regiment to be raised in the North. There were some already that were existent in South Carolina and that area. But in terms of the call for the black soldiers to come from the North, there were many who were enlisting the support of President Lincoln. One of them that was very influential was Lewis Hayden, who lived at Southack Street. He invited Governor Andrew over to his house for the instant of Thanksgiving dinner on November the 27th, 1862, to discuss this issue and the request to Lincoln. Others who were involved in this force that would bring forth the regiment were Frederick Douglass, who had spoken with President Lincoln personally in 1862, around July, I believe he was speaking with the president about this, and another man who was really from South Carolina, Robert Smalls, who had commandeered through his enslavement on a Confederate ship called the Planter. He had commandeered that, knew the captain's calls, forced the ship through the blockades, and turned over the ship to the Union Army. He was commandeered by Lincoln for this brave act, as that was an artillery boat that was loaded, and his opinions were very much respected. So he also was admonishing Lincoln to raise this 54th Regiment.
Now, people who saw the movie Glory, you know, we remember there's a period of training, they're wearing the Union Army outfits and everything. But what about before that? Were people sort of prepping in some way for this?
In Beacon Hill, there was a company that I call the Massasoit Guards, as they were known for their bravery and might, who were already training at the foot of the black community on Cambridge Street. They were doing regular drills and readying themselves for what might become this regiment. There was some speculation that this would be an opportunity to fight in the Civil War, and Frederick Douglass quotes Byron as he says, "We must be the one to strike the blow." So there were other militias that were also raised, but this one was the most apparent in Beacon Hill.
You know, now that we've had these controversies over other Civil War monuments, especially the ones with Robert E. Lee in the South, do you look at this monument in a different way now?
Well, I think that when we want to see visual arts impact in the public space that affects American memory, these monumental, meaning large in size, ideas that are fashioned by artists give us an opportunity to retrace the history, to revisit history, to bring to that monument our own experience. With the toppling of some of the monuments, my concern is that there will be erasure of the stories, and that these monuments may need to be there and be present, whether we agree with them or not, to remind us of a period when things were in turmoil, where there was inhumanity being practiced. So it's an opportunity to look at the force of something like the Shaw Memorial as a reminder that there was valor, there was glory, there was might being charged into war. Not that one wants to kill, not that one wants to be engaged in battle, but for the cause of freedom. America's pursuit of the Constitution and liberty was a promise. And so these men believed in that.
You mentioned the black soldiers from South Carolina, and I think there was an attempt to build a monument to them, and it was thwarted, wasn't it?
Well, The Battle of Fort Wagner happened on July 18th, 1863. Colonel Robert Shaw was killed in that, along with some of the men of the 54th. And there was a call to raise a monument almost immediately on Morris Island that did not receive the support of the community. And though funds were raised, it never did come to fruition. Joshua Bowdoin, who is a caterer, Joshua Bowdoin Smith, who is a caterer in Boston, takes the cause of that 54th Regiment monument for his own, and he becomes a fundraiser and raises the first capital for this to be erected in Boston. He is also later elected as a Massachusetts legislator. After that, there is a committee of about 21 men, including Senator Charles Sumner, who take on this executive committee for the commission. And they are contributing large amounts of money for this to happen. It is not until 1883 that St. Augustine's gets to put this money to use in beginning to not only secure the commission, but to fashion it. The first ideas that he had to do with a lone man on a horse.
Officer on the horse.
Officer on a horse that we usually see as the monuments. And he was approached by the Shaw family to think broader, to look at some of the ideas that would support Robert Gould Shaw in his charge on Fort Wagner, with the men of the regiment being represented in the Shaw Monument. And therefore the idea gets much more elongated in terms of being fashioned, because he's in his New York studio. And he then hires black men to sit for the sculpture in New York in his studio. And that then, as a cast effort, becomes the bronze that we see now. But it is with the support of his men that the Shaw family wanted to see this 54th Regiment represented. And the names of the men for the Morris Island sculpture were called for by Robert Shaw's father, Francis Shaw, immediately.
A puzzle that was put to me is St. Gaudens worked with a real-life likeness of the officer Robert Gould Shaw, but for the men in the regiment, he used models when there were still people from the regiment who had survived. There were photos of them. Yes. Why not work from that?
Well, we have to understand that the 54th Regiment was not all recruited from Massachusetts, that there were 1,200 men. And because there was no allowance for black officers to be raised, there were men in the community who rejected that notion and didn't serve in the regiment. So recruits came from Ohio, New York, Canada, Haiti, and some from Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So I think St. Gaudens felt that he could use models who looked like the men while he was in New York. It would have been very expensive to keep coming back to Massachusetts to get them to model here when his studio was in another place. I as an artist, would understand that that is an expensive proposition. So the process as it was 14 years in the making, and he used what was most expedient.
Also about the composition of this sculpture, because I have to admit, I've seen a lot of people on horses around the world, and what I'm always captured by is the foot soldiers, the things they're carrying, and the way this all sort of culminates on that, pair of sticks on the drum. What do you read into that?
I think that St. Gaudens, number one, had studied in a school in Paris of sculpture with Rodin, who was a very fine neoclassical sculptural mentor for him. And the conformation of the horse that we see that he's rendered so well, the bending of the foot in the shoe and the leather.
It points in that same direction.
All points toward that same direction. And I think the way that he executed it gives you no room for doubt that they were headed into battle. The drummer boy at the front leading the regiment is very special in that we have the actual photograph, the daguerreotype of Monroe. He was 13 years old, actually, who had said he was 16 when he served the 54th, who led the 54th into battle. But he was an example of the young people who were engaged in this battle. And as St. Gaudens has rendered him with the kind of sloppy clothes, it is true to life. And he was very concerned that the features be represented well, that the integrity of the water canister that they were carrying, the rolled blanket, the swords, the rifles, the weapons that they were going into battle with were certainly poised in a particular way that were majestic. And so as they go into this battle, you can see the forward motion, as he's very well put it to the public eye.
Do you remember your first impression of this sculpture?
I remember looking at it and just saying, wow, this is very impactful. I remember looking at the fine definition, but thinking about how there must have been in the psyche of the men that freedom was very fragile. It was still something to be sought after. It was not guaranteed, because as they went into war, if they were taken as prisoners, they could be enslaved. Some who had never been enslaved before. There had been those who had come to Boston, and the problem with that would have been that they would have been re-enslaved. And so the idea that they were fighting for the end of slavery in a country that had not really honored them, for me, as I pondered this sculpture, that would have been a problem. But as they showed in their might to not even let the flag touch the ground, the wounded, you see that they were serious in their attempt to represent a people, to bring that integrity forward, to say, I am a citizen, I'm a citizen soldier, and I'm here in America and I'm participating and contributing. So as a person who has challenged what America's political scene is and how people of different cultures and especially those who are African American and have endured slavery come to my mind, these are questions that are not easily resolved, even though serving in a unit. There were times when I think, that were depicted in the movie Glory, there were times when they were challenged by the Union soldiers. Who are you to fight in this war? And those questions being answered in sometimes very nasty terms. So I think I pondered part of that when I first saw this sculpture.
We should finally mention, when the questions are raised in your series of conversations, is there a place people can get some more details of when that's coming out down the line, maybe from a website for the museum?
Yes, the museum's website is www.maah.org, and we are partners in this as a collaborator for this monument to be restored and to be fine in its execution of restoration. And so we'll be following that and updating that on all of our social media platforms for people to be able to keep up with what's going on. We expect it to take at least 6 months.
Thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Lamerci Frazier from the
It's my
Museum
pleasure.
of African American History. We'll have more news in just a moment.